Now, Townie, again, thank you, but stay where you are, as we're now moving into our fireside chat between yourself, Simon McDougall, Deputy Commissioner, Regulatory Innovation and Technology from the ICO in the UK, and Christie Dennehy-Neil, Policy Director of IAB UK, to discuss the ICO's priorities. So a big welcome to Simon and Christie, and thank you for your time. And back over to you, Townie.
You're welcome, and thanks so much for joining us, Simon and Christie both. We could use a fireside in Brussels today. It's about 12 degrees, and I was watching my border collie get covered in hail about 20 minutes ago, but it's all virtual, so we'll have to pretend. The format of this, Simon, is going to be, it's a double interrogation. Christie and I are going to do a tandem, pursuant to which she puts a question and I put a question. If we were all sitting in a room, your head would be spinning, but you're at a safe distance. And I'll let Christie kick off since she's the guest, and we'll see how much we can wedge into the remaining 14 minutes or whatever it is.
Thanks, Townie. Hi, Simon, and hello, everybody. I will crack on because time is of the essence. Let's get started. I think, Simon, we first wanted to touch on privacy and competition. There's obviously a lot of policy and regulatory focus on the intersection of these two areas at the moment in digital advertising, notably due to the work of the UK CMA, but also the EU's DMA and DSA proposals. Some people suggest that a consequence of this, as regulators to start to look at how the steps being taken by some larger players that are aimed at improving privacy, how they could impact competition, there's a suggestion from some people that actually we'll see privacy enforcement taking a backseat to competition enforcement over the coming sort of 18, 24 months. But then conversely, the joint ICO-CMA statement that you published last week emphasised actually that in your view, competition and privacy interventions should work together and can work together. So how do you think we should see this kind of intersection and its implications for the digital advertising industry?
Good questions all, and thanks to you, Christie, thanks to Townie, and thanks to the IAB family for inviting me. I would break that down into a couple of different points. The first is probably the health warning on all of this, because in a minute I'll probably go on to stuff which is the things you'd expect me to say, which is about how the two has been in conflict with one another. So I will say that good stuff, and I do believe that good stuff. It is important to say, to keep in mind when you're talking with any regulator around the world, that regulators are creatures of statute, and as such we are driven by the laws that we have been asked to regulate, to promote, to enforce, and we quite rightly can't step outside of the laws and regulations and the policy objectives that we have in those areas. And if we are, then quite rightly we get legal challenge, which happens all the time. People say this regulator is going beyond their jurisdiction, so we always have to be very careful about that. It would mean we would lose cases. It means that we would not use funds appropriately. So even though I'm going to say a few things about how I see these areas as not being in really a big clash of conflict, it is important to say that both the CMA and the ICO, and this goes for regulators around the world, in the end we have to fulfill our own policy objectives. And if that means we had to pursue things separately, we could still go and do so. There's no, so in terms of privacy enforcement versus competition enforcement, there's no kind of after you, I'll do this, you won't do this. If we wanted to, both regulators could say this is a harm, this is a breach of regulation in our world, therefore we'll do something about it. And indeed they'd have to do that because of the way they're set up. So that's important to say. There's no magic wand for addressing that. The way to address that is for governments to change primary legislation if they want to direct regulators through their democratic processes to do things differently. So that's the first thing to say. What we are primarily doing right now in the UK with both this joint statement between us and the CMA and also the work we're doing with the Digital Regulation Cooperation Forum, which is all part of the same kind of big effort, is trying to make sure that we best coordinate our efforts in our current scopes. And so the statement was the product of lots of really hard work. If people haven't seen this statement, it's a lot of detail in there, 30 pages, talking about this area. This is not just a 2-paragraph, let's all play nicely together statement. It's a meaningful piece of work. Trying to explore the overlapping area around advertising and ad tech and between privacy and competition, and trying to say, okay, given our respective scopes, how does this all work? And what we have found through doing that work is we're not saying there aren't any tensions, we're not saying there aren't any issues, but as we work through the issues, we often found much larger synergies and areas of alignment in our objectives than we found differences. So I don't recognize a big conflict or a kind of need to prioritize one enforcement over the other. What we've really worked out is as we've understood one another's languages and cultures and policy objectives, we're actually very much aligned.
Great, thank you, Simon. I have to apologise, I've got sun in my eyes, ironically. I can't complain about the sun because the weather here is also dreadful, but apologies, my face is looking strange.
No, you're fine.
Townie, perhaps we'll move on to your question just in the interest of time.
Yeah, so I see we're running out. I have a question that you could take a UK perspective on, but it's a theme that arises elsewhere. So we hear, and I think it's even stated in the DSA proposal or the DMA proposal, that the GDPR has actually aggravated the market structure issues that are evident in our sector. Would you agree with that? And I'm curious about whether you agree with that. And the other sort of narrative that one hears is that is perceived as a sort of policy error that needs to be corrected. And so we may be entering a period where the emphasis is going to be on economic policy, competition, and less on privacy compliance. Yeah, and that's a narrative that in some ways seems counterproductive in light of other aspects of our current environment. So yeah, any comments on either of those thoughts?
Lots of comments, and there's a whole conference to be had out of those statements on themselves. So I'll keep myself limited. I don't agree with the initial premise that GDPR itself has exacerbated those tensions for two reasons. Firstly, there's an awful lot of complication there between different factors, different market trends, different players in the market. And we're very conscious as a privacy regulator, not only that in the digital world we're working alongside other regulators, but also we're not driving this market. There are many other factors, and I'm sure much of this conference is focused on what's happening with Apple and Google and what's happening elsewhere in the market. There's a whole range of trends. And our part is just one cog in that wheel. To say that GDPR has done that is I think a bit simplistic. Have I seen sometimes people mentioning GDPR in a way which seems confused and maybe using privacy as a way to advance a preferred business model to another business model? I've seen that in many sectors, and I've seen that with other bits of regulation as well. And lots of organizations will always lean on regulation that is useful to them in their particular markets, and I don't think the advertising market is any different there. So I think, and the third thing I'd say is GDPR is 3 years old. It's a very new piece of regulation still, and from a economist's point of view, it's too early to draw those conclusions. It's something I think we've got to be alive to, and I think we are very keen at the ICO, where we've always had, since the Deregulation Act in 2015, we've always actually had ourselves an obligation in the UK to consider economic growth as part of our considerations. It's not as if we're being alien to that concept, but we do need to go forward and make sure we're thinking holistically about our objectives and other regulators' policy objectives and general economic and growth objectives, because there's a whole range of factors there to think about.
Simon, you've practically teed up my next question almost perfectly, so that was either accident or design. But yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit about, back to the UK specifically, and how the UK might position itself with respect to privacy over the coming sort of midterm, I guess 3 to 5 years. It was interesting, the DCMS Secretary of State, so that's the department that's responsible for both data and data protection and digital, recently described the ICO as one of the UK's most important economic regulators, which was quite an interesting use of language. And we've seen the UK government's national data strategy as well, setting out the government's vision for both high standards of data protection for the public and avoiding unnecessary barriers to data use for business. So in terms of kind of the balance between user privacy and business pragmatism, I wondered if you could just talk a bit about how you, but also the other regulators that are part of the forum you mentioned. And so for those who don't know, that includes obviously yourselves and the CMA, but also the financial conduct and the media regulators in the UK. How are you thinking about that balance? And do you think that balance can be improved?
I think so. The UK government, so in some of the statements, Christie, you've mentioned that John Whittingdale and others from the government have made, I think they've been clear that yes, they're committed to high standards, and they're committed to adequacy as well, data adequacy in GDPR terms, which is also critical. But they're also open to reform, and it's obviously up to government to contemplate if there's any changes they want to make to the regime. And I think government has, in its response to our national data strategy and the comments made around that by John Whittingdale and others, been clear on their plans there. And so it's up to government to have a think through that, but that's something which we stand ready to engage with as a regulator, keeping in mind that it's up to government to make those changes and us to regulate. It's something we are very conscious of. It is an interesting choice of words. We didn't used to think we were an economic regulator, and I think in terms of some economist sides, they probably would object to us being defined as an economic regulator. And at the same time, in the last few years, we've increasingly found ourselves working very closely with the economic regulators. And we all recognise now that questions of data and digital are intertwined with the economy. So yes, the interplay is there. And the Digital Regulation Cooperation Forum is very much a recognition that those boundaries have collapsed. So when we are looking at questions around, let's say, large technology platforms and how they are using personal data profiles to personalize services, to target advertising, to find insights about people for other products and services they have, the CMA is just as interested in how the very same data sets are being used to exercise market power. And we're looking at the same sets of noughts and ones sitting on the same servers wherever they are in the world for different objectives and interests. So we do need to be much more joined up about that. Now, like I say, going back to my very first comment, what we're looking to do right now is say, okay, within the statute we have and the objectives and priorities and restrictions we have, how do we maximize our efficiency, our competency, our capability, our effectiveness between ourselves? We also submitted another, and this is all published and available online, we also submitted another document to government at the same time as sharing our work plan for the Digital Regulation Cooperation Forum, talking about some options that could be contemplated by government for further legislation that would change how we work together, and talking about different duties to inform and cooperate and consult and those kind of things. So there could be more that could be done by government if we wanted to legislate in this area. And in the meantime, we're just going to try and do everything we can to work together collaboratively to make sure that the UK has a stable, well understood, robust digital regulatory landscape where people want to come and do business and people can feel safe and secure and they're protected in their online lives.
Maybe before the team cut off my electricity, because we're getting close to overtime, anything you can share or be willing to give away about the state of play on the ICO's investigation into RTB, EdTech and RTB?
In a way, it's not much that it's what we've said publicly already, that basically the phase of work we are now at within is a series of audits of different players in the UK digital advertising industry with one eye on data management platforms, and really trying both to understand how data processing and data sharing is working by different players in the industry, and also to learn from that what's going on in the industry. And that really hasn't, when we were first working in this area, that was going to be the next stage of work. We paused it for COVID because we were diverted resources onto more urgent matters, and then we unpaused that work and carried on. And in that respect, the direction of travel for us hasn't changed much. And the concerns that we had going back to our June 2019 report, those themes are still very apparent. Everyone here will be familiar with looking at supply chain and security and lawful basis and all those good things. At the same time, and I'm sure again it's been much discussed in this conference, the market has moved on massively. The overall advertising and marketing world is very different in terms of focus and budget and technologies. And what's going on in terms of different initiatives with some of the large technology platforms has changed as well. So we know the world has moved on, but in some ways our underlying concerns haven't moved on pretty much. So we're pursuing our audit program. So that's very much, we have to be very careful there, Townie, as to what we say, because in that audit program, we're using our regulatory powers. And as such, we need to make sure we follow due process and that we're fair and that we go through the right steps. Because if we didn't, then that would not be fair on the organizations we're auditing, and it might impinge what we can do later. So I'm sorry to give you a boring regulator's answer on that. I like talking about these things, but that's where we are right now.
I think it's helpful for everyone listening to be reminded of where it stands. So thank you. Christie, any final?
No, I think Simon's touched on pretty much everything. I guess perhaps a broader question, just not specifically on the investigation, but just, I know you've talked and other regulators in the forum a lot about stakeholder engagement and how important that is and putting a real focus on that. And is there anything more you can say about what we might expect to see on that in the coming months?
I think there may be times where in the UK, the DRCF engages as the DRCF, because only really, but you've got to remember that, like I say, this is a kind of voluntary group. It has its own, put resources into it, and it has its own team, but it's still, it doesn't have its own legal personality or anything or such. So the majority of engagement will still go through the individual regulators. Now, that might, if all the 4 regulators involved all find it useful to have some engagement together, then that's great, and we may well do that on some occasions. But I wouldn't expect too much in terms of engagement. The DRCF is mainly focused on how we best work together as regulators and solve common problems and develop common positions, rather than looking to go to the outside world and do lots and lots of engagement.
That's very helpful. Thank you, Simon.
All right, now I think we got the hook. Constantine looks serious now. Listen, it's really you to take the time and join us today. So thanks for a lot of information, rich answers and thinking, and nice to see you. And take care.
Thanks, Townie. Thanks, Christie. Thanks, everyone. Bye now.
Bye-bye.
Bye.